unfortunately I had to give priority to a meeting of a research project which suddenly was scheduled at the same moment. Well, as you know, I have tried to summarize the debates on diversification and structural developments of higher education systems in the late 1980s and around 1990. And at that time I had argued that we have an enormous persistence of varied models of higher education in various countries. There is a debate about common directions of modernization, but there's also a debate about different policy options with regards of the structures of the higher education system, notably the question what degree of diversity is desirable, and there are national traditions and national prerogatives, and they interact in policy decisions about the system. But what can we say now, you see, a couple of years later, about developments of higher education systems, about related policies, and about concepts aiming to explain both the development of systems? What can we say what has happened since about 1990? First, I would say we continue to observe structural changes of higher education systems in Europe. We note in Europe constant efforts to change the system of higher education. Whereas in the United States, for example, or in Japan, we are more likely to observe constant efforts on the part of individual universities or other institutions of higher education to change their position, to reposition them within existing structures. So we almost can say in Europe we observe collective patterns of mobility of whole sectors of the higher education system. Whereas in the US or in Japan, we more frequently observe individual mobility of individual institutions within given structures. It is not easy to explain these differences. Probably we can assume that legal frameworks and governments play a stronger role in Europe, and they have a stronger impact on creating generalized patterns of a system. And also in Europe we have less heterogeneity of quality, reputation and profiles within the sectors of higher education. So therefore this energy of change is moving towards collective change. My second major point would be the directions of formal structural changes in Europe are not as uniform as some observers suggest. For example, as you know, when the British polytechnics were upgraded to universities in 1992, some experts argued that we would now have a universal trend in most countries away from two-type and multi-type systems of higher education towards unitary systems. But this did not turn out to be true. Shortly after, for example, Austria and Switzerland established Fachhochschule, somewhat similar to what has happened decades before in Germany, and Finland similarly established the Amati Korkeakolo Kolo as a second type of higher education institutions. And in addition, we notice that various institutions traditionally not being part of higher education at all, became a new type of, how should I say, non-higher education, but tertiary education. We have in Europe an umbrella organization of higher education institutions other than universities. It's called EURASHI. And this organization has a constant flux of memberships, some moving out in order to be recognized as universities, and some others move in from the bottom, institutions which previously were higher vocational schools and now become institutions of tertiary education. Well, of course, some people think that this new trend in Europe, often called the so-called Bologna process, is indicating a same direction or uniform direction of change, structural changes of the higher education system. It is true that in the context of the Bologna process, a stronger emphasis is put on levels of programs and degrees, bachelor, master, doctor programs. But we talk about convergence, getting somewhat similar, not about harmonization, a word used to a high degree of similarity. It is clear that the levels of programs and degrees now are becoming the single most important dimension of formal structures of the system across all European countries. But at the same time, we observe quite varied developments as far as the role of different types of higher education institutions under this umbrella. Just to take the example of Germany, so decisions were made that both universities and Fachhochschule might offer bachelor programs, and these bachelor programs should not be formally divided into different types. They might have a different curricular thrust, more academic, more applied and vocational, but they are not formally divided. And graduates from both types of institutions in principle are entitled to apply for admission to master programs. With regards to master programs, also the principal decision was made that they can be offered both at universities and at Fachhochschule. But there some variety might exist. Some programs are called consecutive. That means students, as a rule, transfer directly from a bachelor degree up to a master program, where others are seen being a part of continuing professional education. So students, as a rule, are expected to provide evidence of professional experience as part of entry requirements for these programs. And among these consecutive programs, the institutions have to decide whether they opt primarily for an academic emphasis or primarily for professional emphasis, and they have to decide whether these programs are defined by disciplines or whether they have some kind of cross-disciplinary, for example, thematic definition. So in general, it is assumed that Fachhochschule will go on to have a strong professional or vocational emphasis within the bachelor programs. They also will be expected to have smaller range master programs than the universities, and they will expect it to offer most of the master programs as professional programs or applied programs, and only a few as so-called academic programs. So this would be one example to show that institutional variety will go on alongside a prime emphasis on level. I think there is a tendency of underestimating the role of different types of higher education institutions in international debates, because it's obvious that if you have some higher education systems where you have differences of levels but not of type of institution, and you have other systems where you have different types of institutions, if you want to put them under a common framework, one is likely to opt for levels rather than types. That's why, for instance, in OECD statistics, prime emphasis is placed on levels. And also if there are European recognitions, European negotiations for recognitions of degrees, for instance for professional value, it is obvious that one is talking about levels or years of study rather than on type of institutions. But this doesn't preclude the fact that in some countries these different types go on to play a substantial role. My third point is we observe an ambivalence as far as informal dimensions of diversity are concerned. Whether we are emphasizing a high degree of homogeneity of a higher education system in a country, or whether we emphasize increasing diversity of levels of quality, of reputation, or of profiles. In Europe, we have two lines of future debates looking ahead to the year 2010. One is the Bologna process and the idea of an emergence of a European higher education area. And there's a second debate about a European research area. And in this context, strong emphasis is placed on competition for excellence. So in a way, we could say emphasis on an elite sector. And there often suggestions are made to concentrate the available money on a few universities and eventually having select set of elite universities. And in this context, often the United States are discussed as a model. However, in some countries, the view is widely spread that we should not have elite universities excelling in a wide range of subjects and concentrating on the wide range of subjects, but rather having a diversity, some excellent fields in one university, in other excellence fields in other universities, and also the idea that we should establish, that we should focus on centers of excellence rather than universities of excellence. Probably we could also say the idea of centers of excellence and universities of excellence do not play such a big role anymore nowadays, when other media become more important and cooperation does not depend anymore on local physical presence of excellence people. So I would not be surprised if we soon end up in a debate about networks and excellence, and then we have to discuss what this would mean for the patterns of the higher education system. But it is clear that in this debate about this European research area, the attention is primarily paid to a top level, and there's an idea that there would be some kind of stratification. But the ideas how much stratification is really accepted continue to differ substantially within the different countries. For example, in Germany, where we wanted to have a certain degree of vertical homogeneity in the past, now we talk about centers of excellence, elite universities, but we do not really talk about vertical diversity. So the whole debate for centering on centers of excellence, etc., in a way are combined with strong criticism of those institutions which are below average. So there's not a real acceptance of a wide vertical diversity, but rather the focus on the top is just combined with more critique of somebody who's not in some institutions which are not at the top. So we have across European countries quite an uncertainty what quality differences within a country are acceptable and desirable. Also, in the context of the Bologna process, you see, two goals were emphasized initially. One goal was attracting students from all areas of the world, and in this context, possibly the most talented one. This can be seen or can be embedded with debate in some kind of vertical diversity. But the second major goal emphasized in the Bologna process is facilitating mobility of students and graduates within Europe. And it is clear that with formal mechanisms of introducing the same structures, of introducing credit systems and other elements, underscored as facilitating mobility, can only work if there is trust that is a similar position in the formal system is an indicator of a similar quality. So in a way, you could say the emphasis on structural changes in Europe for the purpose of facilitating student mobility in Europe is an emphasis against very varied quality levels within higher education institutions of the same type or in the same level. We have, as regards horizontal diversity, we can say that some emphasis is made to strengthen diversity of profiles between different institutions and programs. For example, some evaluation systems recently established emphasize fitness for purpose of the different institutions and the different profiles. It would be fair, however, to say that the majority of evaluation and accreditation processes established and the majority of publications, analysis and debates focus primarily on ranks, on institutions according to a vertical dimension. And this is so dominant that we can say probably the debate on ranks is undermining any kind of encouragement of diversity of profiles. Well, this fourth area which I am interested and like to share a few views with you is our search for explanation of structural trends. I believe that we have some models in the past which were most often referred to by higher education researchers. The first model I would call expansion and diversification, just the assumption if student enrollments go up, the degree of diversity is bound to grow. The second were the so-called drift theories, assumptions that higher education institutions and all the actors within the higher education system all would try just to follow the direction of the institutions of high reputation. The third direction of explanation would be flexibilization theories. They just would say the whole trend of the higher education system would be whatever kind of structures are emerging, not to create the structures in a very hermetic way, but provide all sorts of corrections, of transitions of students, etc. And the fourth direction of explanations can be called cyclical theories. They emphasized whatever you currently note, it is likely to be substituted by another concept within a very short period, and that you see a certain kind of repetitions of fashions over long periods, and often this kind of debates are influenced by cyclical conditions of the labor market of university graduates. And in recent years to these four directions of explanations, a fifth one was added. For example, Guy Neefers emphasized this very much, namely that many decisions taken regarding the structures are political imitations. One tries to anticipate what will be a political success story in the future. One starts campaigns across different countries to follow similar lines. The Bologna process is a typical example of this. But my fifth point is that if we look carefully at these explanations in the past, these explanations were only addressing a relatively small range of aspects of major forces explaining the change, the structural change, and the tendencies of diversification. There was in the past a strong emphasis on the talents and motives and job prospects of the students. This was one major area we've seen of forces affecting diversification of higher education. A second was the question of compatibility of research and teaching. Frequently the assumption that higher degree of concentration in research is needed and a higher protection of an elite sector of research, whereas in teaching and learning one could have a larger system, possibly also a somewhat more homogeneous system. So the question was how these different things are coexisting. And third, there was an idea that we have certain typical ways of actors' behaviors and policies, for example, as those which lead to a drift. But now, suddenly, in the recent years, the view widens about the forces which might play a role. For example, we discussed this kind of broader range of forces in the framework of the UNESCO Forum of Higher Education, Research and Knowledge. Among the participants of this conference, for example, Sarah Guri-Rosenblit was very active in this project. And so we added in this project the list of major factors which can underlie the trends of the structures of the higher education system and the patterns of diversity. The first thing which has obviously, first force which became more prominent in recent years, that international cooperation and mobility might affect the structures of the system. You know, I already provided this example that the Bologna process is calling for structures which most likely facilitate recognition of study abroad. A second additional force might be called globalization in terms of blurring national systems and in terms of an increasing global interconnectedness. In this context, for example, we note that many institutions want to position themselves on a world map, and this seems to be more a competition for elite positions in a diversified system, and this might lead to a steeper stratification within national higher education systems. A third new force, or a force which we hadn't paid attention so much in the past, were new media. The system of higher education might change if cooperation across countries is undertaken primarily through virtual means. This is reinforcing transnational education. This, as I said before, might lead to the fact that we need to a lesser degree, elite universities and local physical centers of excellence, but might just lead to networks in a flattened hierarchy of higher education institutions. Fourth of these new forces are the new steering and managerial modes which spread in Europe in the last 2 decades. It looks as if these new steering and management modes put emphasis on the rank of the institution, on the profile institution, possibly on the individual mobility of the university within the system, irrespective what the structures are. So we could almost say the emphasis, notably on new management system, is losing sight of the overall pattern of the system as well. And finally, the fifth new force might be called knowledge society. So the demand of future knowledge might play a substantial role in respect of the desirable structures and the acceptable structures and the structures of the system strived for. Everybody seems to agree that we are moving towards a knowledge society, but if you look closely, the views what is knowledge society is very dramatically. Again, looking in terms of diversity, there are some ideas around that knowledge society is characterized by a competition for top knowledge. And those who harbor the top knowledge are ruling the world. And so knowledge society is a kind of competition for ruling the world by controlling the sector of excellence of higher education and research. On the other hand, we note ideas that knowledge society might be primarily shaped by masses being knowledgeable. The more we succeed in spreading knowledge, understanding, independent action across the society at large, the more we will be successful in coping with the challenges of the futures. This is a vision which puts less emphasis on stratification or segmentation in the higher education system. It is a view which would reinforce possibly very flat hierarchies in higher education. In sum, I can say, in the last few years, the views about the development of diversity in higher education and the structures did not move towards more transparent, towards a more common model which can be easily explained. Ambivalences goes on, heterogeneous options go on, and explanations are widening in scope. Probably we can say we are moving towards more complex systems and more complex explanations. So the search for an acceptable pattern of the higher education system seems to go on, irrespective whether in individual countries the pattern of collective mobility is prevailing, or in other countries the pattern of individual mobility is prevailing. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you.